Hello, welcome to the 15-Minute Hour. Today I'm joined by Seraphim Calvin and our returning guest, Jonathan. I think that Calvin has some news clips he wants to read, and then we're going to move on to the topic we discussed last time. I feel like I left everyone off in moral nihilism, so I kind of wanted to return to that and give you a hand out of the abyss. All right, Calvin, what do we got today?
All right, the first news article for you is that there are thoughts of legalizing psychedelic drugs for the treatment of depression and PTSD, such as LSD and other psychedelics. What are your thoughts on that one?
I'm going to take a pretty Foucauldian approach here and say that it's another system of control. This is actually pretty related to the podcast we did on Pharmacon. In and of itself, I think there is a tradition that can provide Pharmacon in a responsible way, but basically anything that the beast touches turns to shit. So once that is in the control of powers that be, it just becomes another method of control. And even going back to like the 60s and Timothy Leary, that was all CIA anyway. So it even back from then, it's been about a way to sort of artificially impose cultural values like the sexual revolution or something. Jonathan, do you have anything on that?
Yeah, I've got a history with drugs and I've done my fair share of psychedelics. And I'm not going to lie, including in the last year. It's a terrible idea. 100% the worst idea. It's like legalizing weed. I've never known anyone to do anything in life that continuously smokes weed, right? The problem with psychedelics is it opens doors. You don't know if it's above or below.
Yeah.
The whole thing with set and setting is correct in a sense, but even before, the beast gets a hold of it, I don't recommend psychedelics for most people.
Mm-hmm.
It's unless you are pretty strong in the mind and you have a pretty good hold on who you are, because you'll see things that you do not want to see. I'll tell you real quick about a trip I had recently, the last 2 years, on shrooms. My buddy Tom and I drank some shrooms in his downtown apartment. And suddenly, it just occurred to me why they're serial killers. It made perfect sense.
Uh-huh.
I saw people as just clay, so many people. And we could walk down the streets, I would differentiate between this person's like a real person, this person's an NPC in which they were clay.
Mm-hmm.
And I took on this whole mindset. I had to have this inner struggle in my mind to get over that. That's never occurred to me before in my life. And so it brings up demons, and it just opens you up to the spiritual realm. Yeah. And as we talked about last week, there's a lot of demons in that realm.
Right. I think if you're like a sort of atheist materialist, there could be initiatory value. But as Jonathan says, it's very dangerous and it could backfire. And I will say I've seen people take it like once or twice and then their life got turned around in a good way because of that. But that's probably the rarer case.
All right, the next headline we've got is that the pandemic's effects may have lowered baby IQs. Several studies found that babies who came into the world before the coronavirus had a cognitive score hovering around 100, and the babies that were born during the pandemic were at 78, a difference of 22 IQ points.
It's so hard to isolate that sort of stuff and tell what exactly is going on. I mean, would there be some potential effect from vaccinations or stress that the mothers are having? Maybe, yeah. But what I do wonder about in regards to this isn't even so much the vaccinations, but the psychological effect of masks with children. And the Freudian in me wants to think that there's going to be some weird fetishization revolving around the part of the face that gets covered. I don't know, but I don't really have much to say on this, really.
Do you have any thoughts, Jonathan?
Only that we've been getting progressively stupider over the last 100 years. So What is it? How is this news? If you read a book written in the 1930s, a normal novel, nothing crazy, it will be so far above anything the mainstream has ever come out with in the last 50 years. And that it's shocking.
Mm-hmm.
And we've gotten so stupid. And I've noticed this. I had a girl, I'm not joking, I work with, college degree. Guy from out of town asked her, "Is this the Eastern time zone?" She was like, "I don't know. College degree." Perhaps that's because she didn't grow up with television when it was like 7 p.m. Eastern, 6 p.m. Central. But still, we've gotten incredibly stupid. So neither one of those is it's just, that's old news to me.
Yeah.
Alrighty, the final headline we've got for you, Corey, is that several TikTok stars, including minors, out-earned many of America's top CEOs. They earn more money than most of the S&P 500 companies' CEOs, just making dancing videos during the pandemic.
Yeah, I'm going to say this is good in the same way that I say cryptocurrency is good, in the sense that it is a more honest, full frontal aspect of what modern society is and what the modern economy actually is, in the same way that cryptocurrency sort of is its very existence is a critique of fiat currency, right? The critique of crypto is that it's not based on anything. But that's also true of the fiat currency. It's supposedly supposed to have some level of connection with. So I think it's the same thing here, where you have CEOs that are making money usuriously. It's just as fake or unreal. Like, Dante puts the users and the homosexuals in the same circle of hell because they both rub two things together unnaturally to create nothing. So in the same way, at the very least, in the same sense, there's a, why not, right? Why just take it to its total abstractification? At the very least, that's a more honest form.
Do you have any thoughts, Jonathan?
My kids bring this up all the time. They watch these stupid YouTube videos. I'm in a war right now with my kids over YouTube because I cut out the Minecraft to an hour a day. So these little punks, they try to get around and say, okay, can we watch YouTube? The mom says yes. I get home. Anyway, they watch these little shows where these guys have all this money, right? And all they do is talk about video games or something stupid. And it does make you mad. Mm-hmm. It infuriates me. Like, it's not only that they're just talking about video games and making money, but they're absolute idiots.
Yeah.
But, I think it goes back to what we were talking about last week. I don't know what the repercussions for this are going to be. I mean, who cares? You get more stuff, you need more stuff. It's a vicious cycle. Just because some guy went to college and decided he wanted to be a CEO and worked his way up through all these years of hard work and finally makes $1 million a year, and two complete, utter idiots get on YouTube and talk about bullshit and they make $10 million a year. Who cares? Mm-hmm. It's just money. It's just going to make them more miserable anyway. And we all know that the YouTube shit's going to end. I don't know how. I mean, everything ends. This whole ride is going to end. So what then?
I do also have one more thing. The more I think about it, the more unsurprising it is, because they get their money really the same reason that those CEOs would get their money. Whereas the reason those CEOs are paid such big money is for credibility for the company, as they're trying to track big name CEOs in the business world. And these brands that pay these TikTokers to promote their products, they're just giving them extra money for the credibility, that name. So it really basically is the same reason. It's just a different sort of subject matter, I think.
Well, on this note, I think we'll shift over to.
Do we mention what we were drinking today?
Well, I'm not drinking anything. I was drinking coffee, but I'm dry now. So, Seraphim.
I'm not even drinking.
Okay, no.
Our Plato class.
Okay, yeah. And Jonathan just has his water, and Calvin, you got your coffee.
All right.
It's a very, very Puritan class today. Yeah, we had a Plato class last night on the Gorgias, which went much better than I was actually expecting. It's actually a good dialogue to jump off with, or Plato in general, really, because in the Gorgias, Plato aligns, he's having this debate with Callicles, a sophist or rhetorician or orator, and basically trying to take Callicles' argument that pleasure is really, the source of all that is good. And Plato at first seems to contradict this, but then he makes this weird rhetorical move. Well, it's not weird if you know Plato, where he's sort of shifting pleasure and the good to actually be one and the same, just not in the way Callicles thinks. Or at the very least, pleasure is the hook by which we are designed to accord ourselves to the good. And this argument will be more fleshed out in Republic. I think one thing I want to say is that this was more or less, Plato's obviously putting it in a sophisticated philosophical form, but this was more or less the intuition of most cultures throughout history, that pleasure was something almost by design to lead you to the good, and that, as we discussed in the last podcast, what that pleasure is and the definitions and confinements of it may very well depend on your case, your spiritual case in a society. But in either case, pleasure can corrupt, but it can also lead to the greatest heights of man. Freud, Dante, and Plato, basically in their own ways, all seem to be making this point. One thing I want to add on to this is that I don't, Nietzsche will come along later and say this was something that was sort of disrupted by Plato and disrupted by Christianity. But Nietzsche grew up in the confines of a very moralistic, I think, degenerate Christianity, which is, whether you're right or left, although more superficially, more overtly might be the word I want, on the left, has become the sort of foundation of ethics and sort of tribalism, which is this moralism based on being an altruist or being selfless. And what I want to say is that basically everyone is always already egotist. There is no such thing as altruism, and that egoism is good. The thing is, from the Christian viewpoint, the Orthodox viewpoint is that we are designed from the get-go as Adam to have an egoism or desire that is directed to God and only God. In the fall, that is corrupted, and then everything becomes an idol where your pleasure is fixated or fetishized through another object before it gets back to God. This is why the saints will say that idolatry is not only the worst sin, but also the inevitable one. No matter how high you get in the spiritual life, you always have to use words or concepts in order to get to God. Only in absolute Gelassenheit might be the word Meister Eckhart will use, or total surrender and going beyond words do you begin to really access the name, the true God behind the names of God. Dionysius, their apologites understanding. And then so in this regard, the pleasure that aligns us to the good is best understood when we sort of just cut the bullshit with being altruist and just accept our egoism. And then from there is where I think you can start to do actual ethics. It's not this moralism of good and evil, but an aspect of what is virtuous. All right, Jonathan.
It's interesting. It's from if you read it like, say, an alchemical perspective, they would say that's completely wrong. In the sense that all pleasure does is lead to the Ouroboros of more pleasure, more pleasure,
well,
more pleasure,
corrupted
more pleasure,
pleasure.
death. Well, all pleasure leads to corrupted pleasure is what they would argue. It's like a drug addict, right? You take an opiate the first time, it feels great. 2 days, you don't take anything. And you start thinking about that pleasure again, take another one. Next thing you know, you're shooting heroin. And it's just like that, that thing. But I think a higher way to look at that would be it's the same thing as pain.
Maybe the better word here is desire than pleasure. I mean, this was sort of what was brought up in the class yesterday with Buddhism. Like, does Buddhism actually teach a sort of nihilism in regards to desire? And this is controversial with Buddhist scholars. Some people say that's a gross westernization of Buddhism, and that actually there's a desire that exists beyond all desires, but only becomes realized in enlightenment or when you've eliminated all desire.
I mean, that's every occult tradition is going to say get rid of desire. That's not...
Yeah, right. But in this sense that there's a purification of all lesser desire that leads to true desire.
To the true will.
Yes. So in which sense, it's not really so much, maybe pleasure is not the best word, which alchemy would condemn, but actual desire for the good.
Something I've thought about a lot lately, just a lot in the last year, is there. But like, let's take you and have an aesthetic, right? Live this life where they whip themselves and they barely eat. Someone like Raymond Lully, and they never even touch their organs, their sexual organs, and they just the complete life of utter depravity in the sense of pleasure, like a deprivation of pleasure, right? What are they after? They're after something.
Yeah,
they're not doing that for no reason. But what they're after, I don't know if we'll get this now, but is what both Evola and Guinan and Gurdjieff and Crowley all preached. They're after all the same thing. And Crowley took the left-hand path and to the extreme. But what is his most famous saying? It's not his, but he stole it. But do as thou wilt, which comes from Rabelais. What's the meaning of that? Do God's will. And it's where Crowley talks about he wants the world to through pleasure, right, to corrupt itself, civilization to corrupt itself further and further and further and further, to destroy itself, to bring on the new aeon, the new age. What's Evola say? You're living in a corrupt world. It's going down the toilet faster and faster and faster, faster. Surf the yuga, rise above it. They're saying the same thing. The world's ending. We're bringing about the new age. It's just one. Evola's more of a suffering kind of person. Crowley's more of a pleasure kind of person, desirous person. But it's the same side of a coin. We're different sides of a coin. It's like that Revelation 3:16. Whether you be hot or cold, rather than lukewarm. It's just the two extremes of the pendulum. But the end result is always the same.
Yeah, even Evola wasn't really an ascetic.
Not really.
Yeah, I
but
mean,
more so than Crowley.
Yeah, Andrew likes to talk about how he was railing this feminist, and then right after going on to write these what would be considered today misogynistic screens, doing these weird occult rituals with this Italian feminist, I think.
Well, you already said about feminism, right? You remember this from Revolt, I'm sure. That feminism's awful. It's the destruction of Western civilization. But
yeah, goddess worship.
But I don't blame him at all because there's no men left.
Yeah,
it's kind of how he saw it. Like, what are they supposed to do?
Mm-hmm. Right. I've always thought about this too. Like, critiques of feminism tend to fall flat for me, if only because in traditional terms, the woman is a reflection of the man. So you can't really even have a genesis of virtue or corruption in a woman without it first being initiated in a man. Which, speaking Freudianly, in many cases is the father, but it has to be a man at some point.
Yeah. It's something that I see, all the time around me. It's something I try to be as a father. I think about this a lot. But, one of the things when we first met that you brought up to me, but it was exactly right, is that I've never seen someone who studies Crowley look healthy, be healthy, have a normal life. And I could not agree with that more, because this is what I think is
that's what kept me away from him.
and that's, I think you would do fine with him, but that's the great sin of Crowley. The great sin of Crowley is he democratized occultism. He said, very Christ-like, come all to me, come all to me. There's no discrimination. You've got all these goofy people coming to him their souls are in no place to be understanding this. And just like in his life, the people who he attracted are the weakest of civilization. And as there's a great biography about him called Eye of the Triangle by Israel Regardie, who was his secretary for a while. He says there's not a single person in Crowley's life that he got close to that end up killing themselves or going insane.
Yeah.
And he just but there are moments in his career when he meets a strong man.
He gets shooed away.
Well, no, one of his best friends is rock climber. I forget his name. The guy thinks occultism is just absolutely stupid. Crowley idolizes this guy and becomes a complete beta when he's around this guy. and you see this a lot with Crowley, even with Yeats. Like he's kind of like, just kind of like, well, whatever you say, boss. But then he attracts these like 19-year-old poets and these drunk girls. There's a lot of journalists that want to know about occultism that come see him, and he just destroys their lives. And that's what you see today with people that follow him, is that these are the weakest of the weak, that people that should never even open the door to occultism. They do so because they want power. That's why they're doing this. They think Crowley is the most accessible. In some ways he is, in some ways he is not. He lies a whole lot. His best book, by the way, with the most truth in it, is called The Book of Lies. But that's his sin, is that he democratizes. He opens the door. He says, come one, come all. I don't care who you are. Where someone like Gurdjieff or Evola or Guénon or Shun, they make it very difficult. Even reading their books is very difficult to understand what they're saying. And they want to weed out all the chaff, They want to get rid of it all. Gurdjieff, he had this club, and when we get over 30 people, he would pull these stunts, like tell everyone, I want you to dig a 10-foot hole today. Now fill it back up. And he would do that for like a month. He would lose half his followers. It's like, okay, now it's better. One time he had like 40 or 50. He shuts down. He's like, I'm done. Walking away where this is over. And he just kind of watches what happens over the next month. And the ones that continue to work, to sit in his chateau and continue to work up by themselves, he kept. The other ones, he just waited till they all kind of trickled out and left. And but Crowley was the complete opposite. Again, it's just come one, come all. If you die, you die. You weren't prepared. Sorry. And you look at someone like Jason Louv, who's the biggest Crowleyan, probably famous today. He looked like shit. He's all scrawny. His eyes are sunk in his head. Looks like
that's the image I get with a lot of.
Yeah, very
very skeletal looking.
Yeah, I just look at this guy and think, boy, that guy must masturbate 4 times a day. I mean, he looks absolutely terrible. But it's because they're not prepared. They don't know what they're getting into. And
it seems like Crowley's like almost actively trapping you, because on one hand he has this seeming accessibility, but like you're saying, he's very deceptive, and it's like he is saying come one, come all, but he's also saying the path is narrow and few are that are saved. So it's like it takes a certain background to really realize where Crowley is even lying to you, to really get anything
100%. Oh, he would completely agree with that.
Yeah.
But really quick aside, his book he thought was his best book. If you talk to any Crowleyan today, they would say his most important work is the Book of the Law.
Yeah, that's what they tell me. Yeah,
it's like 80 pages long. So I've read it like, man, this is horseshit.
Mm-hmm.
Evola, who was a big fan of Crowley, he is sent the book by a Crowleyan later, maybe in the 70s, 60s, something like that. He said, I've liked some of this guy's work, but this is the writings of a narcissistic, neurotic fool. And I couldn't agree more. It's if you believe that shit, you believe anything. Like I can't even get into it. Like it's pretty.
Do you think Crowley believed it? That he was the being he was talking to?
At first he didn't. The first 10 years after it happened, he doesn't.
So he pulled a Muhammad. He's like, oh no, it's not real.
And then as he gets older and as people start to worship him more in these weird little occult circles, he starts believing it. And so by the end of his life, he was like, yeah, that was my most important work.
So I'm just trying to understand the psychology of Crowley. Why would he even go through the trouble of publishing? And if he didn't think the being he was speaking to or listening to was actually real, it was just him. He didn't publish it for 10 or 12 years. Okay, so he waited until he got famous. Yeah. Okay.
I mean, it's a crazy story. Yeah. I mean, just crazy. And if you ever read Blood Meridian?
No, I still need to read it. All my writer friends tell me I have to read it. But we talked about The Judge before.
Holy crap, man. Like, that book is brutal. Howard Bloom says, who says it's probably the third best book ever written by an American, says you need to read it 2 to 3 times to get it. I'm telling you, man, going through one time is rough. Like, you don't want to even look. You can't even fathom the amount of violence in this book. There's not one redeemable character. There's not one character you root for. There's one character who you love, and that's the judge. And he's like Hannibal Lecter. Like, you love the scenes with the judge. You know, he's these great lines. Like, he's always taking notes about the flora and fauna. You know, and he's in his book, and one of the guys is like, Judge, why do you always do that? He says, that which exists without my knowledge exists without my consent. He does these great lines all through this book. But you read this hell, you go through all this suffering for the last chapter. Mm-hmm. And it is a religious chapter if there ever was one. It is on par with Moby Dick. Opens up the floodgates to the divine when you read the last chapter. But my point of bringing that up is you can tell the judge is based solely on Crowley. Mm-hmm. Just because it even has scenes in Crowley's life that are kind of, made a little opaque, but you can figure out what he's doing. But it's almost like if you put Crowley in the Wild West, that's probably what would have happened.
I mean, the judge strikes me as a stronger character than Crowley, though.
Probably. Yeah, no, I'm not saying it was identical, but just some of his, he's just, everywhere he goes, he gets what he wants. Very much like Crowley. Everywhere he goes, he can talk his way into, he has that Ron L. Hubbard kind of Gurdjieffian, like, this magnetism about him. They can just get away with murder. Yeah. I mean, Crowley gets away with murder several times, literally. Like, they just have that presence about him. But there's just a couple of scenes that, like, I know that's what he was getting at. One scene where he's naked with an invalid in the book, when he's naked with this invalid who's naked, who he's been raping, he's on a leash in the desert. That is directly out of Crowley's real life. Like, that's where he got that from. But it's just, Tom had a really good point, my buddy Tom, that the judge is Saturn. I think that might be the case. I don't want to ruin it for, there's like hints everywhere in the book because he's a pedophile. He destroys children. He destroys everything he touches. And the main character, this kid, spends like these 6 years with him. Doesn't see him, thinks he's gone. He shows up exactly 28 years later, looking the exact same, coming back to destroy lives. It's just really interesting. First time you see the judge is in the first chapter, the kid who needs God. If anyone needed a Protestant evangelical, it's this kid. He walks into this like revival, right? Yeah. This pastor is like giving it to them all. And this kid's like getting touched in the heart. This strange, tall, albino looking man walks in. And he says, Pastor, aren't you wanted for rape of an 11-year-old girl over in Jackson Hole County? And the pastor's like, what? He's like, aren't you also wanted for sexual relations with a goat in Knox County? And like everyone's like, what? Oh. They end up hanging this dude. Well, later, some of the guys who hung him saw the judge back at this restaurant. And they were like, I didn't know you from Jackson Hole County. He's like, I've never been there before. I just made that up. Like, and that's basically the judge. I mean, just doing stuff like that. The whole book, I'm not joking. Like raping toddlers, scalping toddlers. Like it's a impossible book to get through, but you do it for the end.
I read a piece of literature sort of like that recently called Tool, period. Have you heard of this?
No.
It was this guy who had this literary magazine who was arrested because one of the front covers for it, I mean, it's in plain sight, was child pornography. I mean, it was like a young girl, being exposed. And the idea of the literary journal was to be as I guess, taboo as possible. And he ended up writing this little book that has several parts. It's hard to get through for similar reasons. But there's one part in it where it's this character who raped a boy and then is in jail, I guess. I don't know. But he writes a letter to the mother and saying how basically critiquing her for being making herself into this sort of suffering hero through the media and using her boy's death. And the killer's just saying, one, your boy's not the good guy you think he is. Like, this is all the bullshit he did. And then two, you're a moral whore. And basically the whole thing that what I liked about this book, despite how difficult it was to read, is that the guy is basically taking a mirror and using that the idea of like, what is the worst possible person you can imagine in today's society. And I think because of sort of Christianity in many ways, like people will abandon Christianity, but they'll keep the devil.
Oh yeah.
In the sense like they forget what Christianity says is good, but everyone now thinks pedophilia is evil. Like that wasn't really evil before Christianity. The whole idea that children even were a concept or had innocence or anything like that. And you brought this question up at the end of the last podcast, what about pedophilia? And it's like, well, it's interesting to consider like most human civilizations didn't even have that as a concept. It really took Christianity to create this idea of innocence that is then robbed, which is what makes pedophilia so evil. So people will abandon Christianity, but they'll very much keep this idea of evil. They'll keep the devil. And what's interesting with this is like it's taking the devil, and this is what the devil very much is tarotically speaking in tarot, is that it's asking you like, okay, sure, there's all these evil things out there that you see, but it's really what you can see. I mean, it's kind of Jungian in a sense. It's like what you see as evil is really just a reflection of what's actually going on here. And it's not like this simple, caricature like, oh, you hate pedophilia because you're a pedophile. It's deeper than that. It's something that about the robbing of innocence, which is what I brought up when you asked that question last time. But what I liked about this little piece was that it was the idea of how the media was doing the same thing. Like he mentions like when he's writing these, like his process of being arrested, and he says in one line, like at the beginning of one of his, like there's a scene where it's just this guy like just raping and insulting this little girl and just saying like, oh, you'll never see your mommy again. But at the beginning of this terrific, thing, he says, when I was arrested, they took my magazine and put the cover on all the newspapers, just like you're doing the same thing I was doing, like, yeah. and basically just using that as sensationalism.
That's a good point. That's interesting. What's called Tool?
Yeah.
There's a book called The Other Side of the Mountain that my buddy Tom recommended. Again, if you have any depressive thoughts, audience, do not read this book. Mm-hmm. I beg of you, because I have none. Never dealt with suicide in my life. It's not been my cup of tea. I thought about it after this book.
Yeah.
But it's an extraordinary religious book. And
The Other Side of the Mountain.
It's by a guy named Bernaud's. It's about 100 pages long, written in the 40s or 50s. I don't even want to tell you what it's about. It's very religious, though. It's Moby Dick, I'd say, is the quintessential American religious book. It's very Gnostic. But both Blood Meridian and, the Other Side of the Mountain follow in that same shoes. But what you were talking about, like when the judge at the very end of the book, he's in this bar of Blood Meridian, and there's a dancing bear and a little girl playing music with a music box beside her. And that's going on this whole time this is going on, this great metaphor. But what he says of this kid, it reminds me so much about the pleasure thing. Because he says, why are you in here? Why are you in this bar? And the kid's like, I need some entertainment. Like the kid right now is like 50 years old by this point. And they always say the judge never ages. It's the exact same. Also never sleeps. It's a whole different thing. But he says, no, that's not why you're in here. What's your reason for being here? He's like, I have no reason. And the judge says, well, someone has a reason. He's saying, basically, he's implying he has a reason for him to be here. He says, I have a reason for everyone to be here. And this is when it kind of takes this idea that the judge is a demiurge or is definitely bigger than Satan, something big. And he goes on to say that, your entire life just kind of gone with the flow, how I've pushed you. You've never pushed back. If something felt good, you kept doing it. If something felt, like you were accepted by the world, you just kept doing it.
Yeah, that's Ouroboros.
I took you over. I took you all did this. You all went along with it. Everything I did, you did it too. And you went right along with it the whole time. And the kid does buck up towards the end of the book. And that's what causes the only reason why the kid's still alive is that there is a point where he talks back to the judge, tries to kill the judge. But the judge's point is that, your life, it's like Saturn. I am controlling your entire life and you haven't done a damn thing about it. So everything that happens to you is your fault. It feels good. You keep doing it. And that was why I found that book. When I finished the book, I was glad, because up until that point, I was like, man, screw everyone told me to read this book. Then you get to this chapter, you're like, holy shit. You think back to this whole book, because he had to tell the story for this to hit home is the way it does. He has to tell this violent story. And all these stupid people following the judge, doing exactly what he's doing, just doing what he's doing. And he's like, you get what you deserve, bro. Like that. You follow pleasure, you get death.
Sorry, I wanted to go back to books that cause suicide. Are you familiar with Conspiracy Against the Human Race?
No.
So it was written by this, I'm trying to remember his name. I know he's like a big Lovecraftian guy.
Okay.
And he normally just writes fiction. Sometimes you hear about philosophers that get into writing fiction. This guy writes fiction, he got into philosophy. Yeah. And he wrote this one book called Conspiracy Against the Human Race. And he just kind of goes through all these pessimists throughout history and says why they weren't pessimistic enough. And basically, like, everything, including me writing this book, is just a way for us to avoid suicide.
It's very denial of death, Ernest Becker.
Yeah, exactly. And he sort of just bites the bullet, and he's like, yeah, Schopenhauer was good, but here's why he didn't go far enough. Or yeah, Nietzsche's good, but here's why he doesn't go far enough. And by the end of the book, you're just like, well, there's a really funny, interesting book by Seraphim Rose called Nihilism, and it's interesting because it's basically the inverse of this book. Just like, this guy is totally right if Christianity is not true. And I read this book with a few friends a while back, like 5 years ago. And I had one friend who isn't like really like a edgy atheist or anything. He's just kind of like blasé agnostic. I never really heard him say anything very profound. But he read this book with us and he said, I feel like this whole book is just like, if you don't believe in this, then you don't believe in this, then you don't believe in this, then you don't believe in this. It's nihilism. So it's just like, I just thought it was an interesting critique, because it's like you have to assent to all these things in order for nihilism to not be the case. And it's like, not being a nihilist is really, like Nietzsche says, a very heroic struggle. And you basically are a nihilist if you don't already realize it, unless you have something, that you create that you're holding on to. But
let me ask you this. This is something that's been bothering me personally. I read most of one of the Evagrius books. Mm-hmm. I watch him because I enjoy his humor. A lot of Jay Dyer. Mm-hmm. I do enjoy his humor.
Yeah, he's funny.
But I think the growing up the way I grew up, and when you read something that almost defines your life, for me, that was revolt against the world. And the idea that there is something way underneath Christianity, something that Christianity is trying to be, but it's a democratized version, a dumbed down version of what this original source is. And it's the Plotinus idea that there's only two things, that lead you up and that lead you down, And so the idea of, I hate to even say this because it sounds so corny, but I guess what drives me is the will of God to the ascension beneath Christianity, the old school, the old Platonic idea of ascension. And so my question is, because the materials on this are so few and far between, and they're so encoded, so hidden, should I just fall in line with orthodoxy? Is that a safer bet than trudging my own individual path through these strange esoteric books?
Yeah, I can't answer that. I mean, I think you have to taste and see. Like, you have to. This is what I said before in the podcast, but like, you can't really do philosophy in a chair, and you have to live it, right? And you can't do religion from a book, right? You really have to go and live it and see what it is, like a scientist in the field. So like, you can't really answer these questions for your soul until you put your soul into the water. And that's why, in one sense, why religion's so dangerous, because it takes such visceral, on the deepest level of the human person, experience and experiment. I say for the vast majority of people, right, it's probably the safest bet you have nowadays in modern America, right?
Yeah.
But I don't know if that's the case for you, right? Or if it even click or appeal to you. I think what you're looking for is in orthodoxy, but it's very esoteric, and you have to get to the right people, and that might be reading to some degree, but ultimately it is living that experience. And at the end of the day, that sort of experience is hard to get outside of a monastic life. So it's a heroic thing you're wanting.
Well, Evelyn would disagree with that. Would say that there's two paths to, the higher God's will. One is action and one is the aesthetic.
Yeah,
and they're from the periphery, from the surface, they look like they're going in two different directions, but they're not at all. And my person. I do. Like, if I find a practice, I do it.
Yeah.
I'm more interested in action than I am in reading.
Yeah.
And that's why I've kind of, there's this old story that this old, I don't know what he was, this imam who was in charge of the burning of the Library of Alexandria. Somebody comes up to him and says, "Sir, what do we do with all these books?" He says, "Well, if they correspond to what the Quran says, it's already in the Quran.
Yeah.
If they do not, it's trash. So burn it all." And that sounds horrific to us Westerners, but he's right.
Yeah. Someone said that about Plato's Republic too.
Oh, really? Yeah.
Burn all the books, for all their knowledge is in this book.
Yeah. But I think with the Bible, the Quran, I think it's true. Once you know how to read it, once you know how to get to the depths of it,
Yeah.
you know, and as far as like, you're saying like at the beginning of this podcast, you want this to become moral nihilism. I don't blame you. I mean, we all have morals, whether we like them or not, you know, based on the society we grew up in. But I think the idea that I live my life by is the Plotinus idea. Either it goes up or it goes down, bro. Like there's hot or cold. And if you're trying to live in the in-between, which almost everyone is, you're going to become nothing.
This brings up two things. One is that I think you're right about these terms. I should say I am a moral nihilist, but I'm not a virtue nihilist.
Yeah.
And then secondarily, it's that I agree with Evola. I'm just saying, as far as orthodoxy goes, the path of action is very inaccessible.
Oh, yeah, I can see that for sure.
It may have been accessible, you know, in feudal times or, you know, medieval times, but for the most part, it's no longer achievable, I don't think.
You don't think like in the idea of the greater or lesser holy wars, you don't think that relates in any way?
Yeah, there's an outer jihad, but it's hard for that to contextualize where there is no real orthodox nation, right? I mean, maybe when the shit hits the fan and like the Kali Yuga really revs up and then you become like a sort of warrior for Christ sort of thing. But I think outside of that, there's only fools for Christ.
That's interesting. What do you think about this is something, I watched a YouTube video of Robert Sepper the other day. It reminded me of this quote in Albert Pike when he talks about the true Christians, the esoteric Christianity, whether it's in the Vatican or in Byzantium or wherever, worships John the Baptist, Johnism. You think that's correct?
Who said this?
Albert Pike.
Yeah, I'm usually very wary of Pike. I have to know what he meant by that. I could see there being truth in that. I mean, I would say that you could say that really about any saint, though, right? So it'd be like there's something in a saint esoterically that is reflecting a deeper truth, and it's not immediately accessible unless you have a very intense devotion to a saint. There is a sense in which John the Baptist is the closest to Christ. We say he's the most virtuous man who is not Christ, basically, right? But and that's why he's always on the iconostasis in Orthodox churches, right next to Christ. It's him and
That's
Mary.
why I asked you that, because that growing up Protestant, you don't see him anywhere.
Yeah,
and that's why I remember when I saw that, I thought of that Pike quote. I don't know.
Yeah, I mean, in the Orthodox calendar, most saints have like one feast day. He has like 7.
Yeah.
So,
Well, I guess if it's any consolation, Gunan and Evel thought Pike was full of shit.
but I'm very wary of Pike. Yeah.
Yeah, I would be too.
I just want to say real quick, it's funny that we did this podcast because it was like, the last one's a little too nihilistic. And then we spent like so much time talking about all these nihilistic, like really nihilistic works. But it did make me think a couple things here. Because you had kind of mentioned, and I don't remember which one it was, but kind of talk about how the media is really moralizing, but it's really kind of doing all the same, shit that, like the killers are and whatever. And it reminds me so much of that film we watched, Natural Born Killers.
That's a great film.
Where it's very overt about that, which is like, it is, and you were saying this earlier, a mirror into what the media is doing. And so it did kind of go into what we've been sort of touching on a little bit in this podcast, the last one, about sort of the false idea of morality.
Yes.
And it makes me go back into, we touched on this yesterday in our Plato class with Gorgias, and going back to Meno a bit about, like what is, what is kind of good and like what is the will for good. And you just said right now, what was it exactly? I am a moral nihilist,
I am a moral
but not a
nihilist,
virtue
but not a
nihilist.
virtue nihilist.
Could you maybe tie some of that together? Like what exactly do you mean by that? And then you were kind of both going back to Plato. And I actually think this is going back to what you were saying about deeper truth within Christianity, sort of about the will, sort of about the falseness of our idea of morality as a concept. And what would sort of that deeper understanding of orthodoxy be?
Yeah.
What would Plato's understanding of that be? And what do you mean by the terms of moral nihilist, but not a virtue nihilist?
That's a big chart
It's a big.
I'll say from the New Testament that violence is done unto the kingdom of heaven, and the violent take it by force, right? And you see the monastic fathers constantly saying this.
Say that again.
Violence has been done unto the kingdom of heaven, and the violent take it by force. This is what Jesus says. Evelyn says it's the best quote in the New Testament, and he says it's also the one Christians most ignore.
Evel also says that's the biggest problem with Adam is he didn't take it far enough. Like God gave him a chance, and he didn't take it far enough. He was a wuss.
And I think Evelyn's correct outside of orthodoxy. Like outside of orthodoxy, you never really hear this, give a sermon on or anything. And there's a sense in which so an aspect of morality. Let me speak really quickly about Max Stirner. And Stirner was this German. Some people say Nietzsche plagiarized him. He was one of the students of Hegel, and he would hang out with the free, like Engels, Marx, and them. And he would sort of just chain smoke cigars and troll people. But he really only wrote one book. I found out about him because I was really into philosophy education, and he wrote this track of education. This was like 10 years ago. And then right when I discovered him, he just blew up. But he didn't blow up in academia, which is interesting. He blew up on like weird internet forums. And what's interesting about him is that he really, in my opinion, he perfects Hegelianism because he takes Hegelianism to its absolute point of going beyond the self. And his whole tract, The Ego in Its Own, which is really what he's known for, his only real book, he's basically just laying out a groundwork for an absolute elimination of all value. It'd be misleading to merely say it's nihilism. So he says, ego in its own right, it's like the unique one. You can't really name it as a self. You can't name it as an ego because that itself is what he'll call a spook or something that possesses you. And this is really what I mean by morality. Morality is something that possesses you. Morality castrates will. Morality has nothing to do with virtue. Morality is something that is like a demon that seizes hold of your superego and makes you think you're a good person. Christianity, real Christianity is all about realizing you cannot be a good person. It's not about goodness. It's not about evil. It's about having a will that corresponds to the Godhead. And that is virtue. That's what Plato's talking about. Plato, if you really look at Socrates, he's an iconoclast of morality. And this is why it's always ironic to read Nietzsche, because he's so critical of Socrates, yet at the same time, he's saying pretty much what Socrates was getting at the same time.
I agree with that completely.
And what you realize in all the best philosophy is that they are all iconoclast of morality. And because morality is evil, and morality is the real evil. Morality is what Adam got by eating the tree of knowledge of good and evil. And funnily enough, modern Christianity has become the champion of morality, but real Christianity is about the destruction of morality.
Yeah, that's true. I agree with all that. And we started there. What I found so fascinating is Crowley would agree with that. Mm-hmm. Evola would agree with that. Gurdjieff would agree with that. They're all after the true will. Yeah. What is the soul's will? Like the spirit, the connection between the two in yourself. Like what is the will? Because what we consider the will, what we consider our life goals, and all this shit is all determined through society, through morality. Mm-hmm. Everything is. And like I said, think what you want about Crowley. I have no doubt he wasn't a good guy. No one's saying that. But that's what he does with people. Like he makes them do some horrific things. And it's the whole idea of break the morality. And I wouldn't follow Crowley if he was around here. I'm not saying that. I don't recommend reading it, Crowley.
It's so funny. I mean, if you really read the Gospels, this is exactly what Jesus is doing. He's iconoclasting morality.
We'll just bring up Crowley again. You said towards the beginning, his big kind of line is "Do as thou will," and and it makes me think about again Plato, which is like what you truly will actually is,
or yes,
God, and everything like you just said. Everything that we think we will is just the media. It's just all this bullshit.
Plato says no one actively chooses to do evil. Evil is a result of ignorance of the true good. And then again, this is very reflexive to what I was saying earlier about egoism. And that altruism is a total spook. Jesus doesn't say, be good to other people. He says, do unto others as you have them do unto you. It's reflexive of ego because Christ isn't a moralist. He's not under some illusion that people can be, goody two-shoes or going to be good altruists. He gives parables like the Good Samaritan precisely to say that this man is doing what he would have done unto him, and that actual virtue is reflexive. And the same thing that Plato is getting at in the Gorgias too, when he says, you harm your soul by yourself. This is true. Like if you do a unvirtuous action, you harm your soul. But if you are a tyrant or a king who does an unvirtuous thing, you are not merely harming your soul, but you're magnifying that harm by all the people you are responsible for.
If you wanted to define a little bit more the moral versus virtue.
Yeah, I guess again, morality is just superego. In the Freudian sense, it's puerile and it's childish. It's wanting to be a good person. It's about on one level, on the more immediate superficial level, it's about wanting to look like a good person. But on a deeper level, it's wanting to convince yourself you're a good person. I mean, you see that there's such an easy target. And I feel bad, but it's so easy to see in SJWs. Because it's so clear that they have no virtue whatsoever. It's pure emotion and it's pure Christianity, which is funny because they tend to critique Christianity. But they're the most Christian people. They're Puritans. They're Calvinists. And it's this idea that once there are unforgivable, irredeemable sins you can commit, and against racism or patriarchy, whatever. And at the end of the day, it's just about looking good, either to others or to themselves. That's morality. Virtue has nothing to do with that. Virtue may very well be concerned with other people, but not in anything dealing with having to convince yourself you're a good person or convincing them. Virtue will convince everyone you're evil if you think it's the good thing to do. That's exactly Socrates' point.
Would you say virtue is the law of cause and effect? The Platonic natural law?
I wouldn't reduce it to law and cause and effect, but it definitely has a lot to do with that. Yeah.
I would just say, to answer your question, he was saying about morality, that's below and virtue is above. Virtue is what leads you higher. And morality is what has you fit in with the lower. Yeah. That's how I would define it. Before we end this, that's something I want to say. I thought about since the last podcast about the case system. Mm-hmm. Somebody asked me recently, why have you and your girl been so successful in your relationship, right? And I've thought about this a lot. And to me, it's obvious looking at my past relationships and the one with her, it's just equal cased. Mm-hmm. That's all that is. I think that is how you form a relationship with someone. That's how it goes well, is equal cased. Also, working where I work at this restaurant, there's a guy who makes way more money than me. He's nowhere near the server I am. And there's no reason, there's no favoritism toward him. There's no reason why. I think it's because he is in the exact position perfect for his caste. Yeah. And I am not. For me, it's always a struggle. I make great money, but it's always a struggle. And I think that's what I was talking about with caste. There's places that you're going to be happy. You don't worry about what everyone else thinks about you. But if you're supposed to be a farmer, or a street sweep or whatever, there's some places that God's will warrants you. And when you line yourself with God's will in that position, your life will flourish. And it's nothing to do with materially, flourish in just your joy, everything's in line with how it should be. And this is how things should be.
Yeah, that's very Confucian, very Platonist. or there's that Copeland song that the Amish sing. How's it go? 'Tis a gift to be where you ought to be. What? 'Tis a gift to be simple, 'tis a gift to be free, 'tis a gift to be just where you ought to be. Right?
I beg it.
It's a very Confucian song. The Amish are very Confucian in this way. I love the Amish. They're my favorite Protestants.
Oh, they're awesome. They're awesome, yeah.
It's the new musical second.
No, please keep the Hildegard von Bingen.
You know what, the Amish?
No. I don't know. Copeland doesn't really ring right with this podcast.
No. Not at all. I think that I hope everyone gets from this the idea that we didn't talk about enough, the difference between virtue and morality. Oh, this is another example, right? This is something you were bringing up. Every Saturday night, I give all 4 dishwashers $20. Mm-hmm. I don't know why I do it. They're all Mexican. They don't tell anybody. They don't speak English. I just slip them a 20, And I do that with other people, and the reason, and I don't know why I do that, except that my life, even honestly, just outside of work, tends to get better when I do things like that. It's like a give and take. I tip if sushi guys, if they work their butt off for me, I give them a little extra money. I don't give them money normally, but you might slip them a 20 or a 50 or something. And you see that, I see that just reflective in everything else I do in life. It's it's not necessarily about being, because nobody knows. It's just, yeah. I just feel like that's what I need to do at this moment. So on Saturday nights, it's kind of weird because they're like little dogs. They all kind of make sure they see me before they leave. It's kind of demeaning in some ways, but I think that's important. And it's not just general. I don't know. It's just when you find the spot, you need to be generous. You be generous, or when and it is reflective.
And that's cause and effect, right? Because that is kind of like you're actually manipulating a certain law there.
Yeah.
Yeah. And it's not, again, it's not to be seen. It's not a moral thing. That's virtue in the sense that it's actually dealing with a law or a principle. Were you going to say something, Calvin?
I was just going to say, I think we're about to the end of the 50-minute hour. Are we?
We are.
So do you have any closing remarks?
Last time I said be good, but not too good. This time I'm going to say when you're in the Ouroboros, you have to cut off the head.
That's true. But you got to find the head first.
Yeah. All right. Well, until next time, and find your head. See you next time.